All right, so I was going to take 2 seconds to show you how to go about debugging your programs. And also you can use the debugger to help you realize how loops are working. Okay, it does help you kind of see how loops are working in your program. So I always thought this was a good time to kind of introduce the debugger. We're familiar with Eclipse and we're getting into loops. We can use the debugger to assist us in learning these loops. So every IDE stands for Integrated Development Environment, and Eclipse is an IDE. But almost every IDE has what's called a debugger. And a debugger is part of the IDE that helps you step through your program one step at a time, one line at a time, lets you see the value of your variables, and lets you see how your code is working. And so it helps you debug your program or fix your program, and then it also lets you see how your code is working. So when you're running a debugger, what you need to put inside of your code is what's called a breakpoint. And a breakpoint tells the debugger when to start and when to start stepping through your code. And to put breakpoints inside of any IDE, you usually go to the margin here. And in Eclipse, it's the same way. You go to the margin, and you might have done this on accident, and you double click. And when you double click in Eclipse, it puts this little blue dot right here. And if you hover over it, it tells you that it's called a breakpoint. So that's when the debugger will start working. Okay. Now you can put multiple breakpoints, but for us, let's just start out with one breakpoint. And I'll go ahead and put that breakpoint here at the beginning of my program. So my program is going to run, and when it gets to the breakpoint, it's going to start the debugger. So to start debugging in any IDE, usually there's some kind of debug button, and in Eclipse they make it look like a little bug. So cute, right? Okay, so you just hit the little button, the bug. It gives us this window where it says, I'm going to start the debugger, and I'm going to open up some new windows here that have to do with debugging. It's called the debug perspective. And you just put yes. And it opens up the debug perspective. So it put our code window down here, it puts a variable window up here, it puts a stack window over here, and then an outline window over here, and then our console window down here. We don't need the outline, so we can close our outline. And we can make this a little bit bigger. But you can see that my program ran, and then when it got to this line of code, it stopped. And now it's waiting for me to tell it to go to the next step. So right here, it's stopped in our program. So all debuggers have these buttons that look like this. There's a step into button, which steps us into a function or a method. That means if we have other functions, which we will eventually in this class have methods, we'll step into those methods to see how they're working. Or you can have a step over button. And we'll click on this one a lot. Okay. Step over means just go to the next line of code and step over the function calls. Okay. Then you have your stop button, and then you have your run button again, your resume button. So these 4 buttons are the ones you'll use. You'll mostly just use this step over button. Now over here on the right, I want to show you too before we start. Here's all of our variables we made. So it shows our number variable. In my program, this was our finding the average of numbers program. Remember that program we made last time? Finding the average of these numbers. And so we made these variables, and you can see those variables here in this window, which is really helpful. It shows you the name of that variable and what that variable, the value of that variable, what that variable has in RAM right now. So when I click on step over, it runs that line of code and goes to the next line of code. And when it ran that line of code, it printed this to the console. Please enter in some integers. And then it's going to print this to the console next, right? This is my next line of code. So I'll step over. It gets to my while loop, and now it's performing my Boolean check. And what is number right now? Number is 1, and 1 doesn't equal 0, so this Boolean is going to be true. And when I click step over, it'll go to this line of code, right? So it goes to that line of code. Now it's asking me for an integer. I'm going to run that line of code, and it's waiting for me to put in that integer. So even when you're in debug mode, if you're asking for input from the user, from the console, you still have to enter in that input. So I'll enter in a number. And then it goes to the next line of code. So it ran this line of code, and it went to this line of code. And do you see what it did when I entered in that number? Because number was being assigned a value, it highlights it in yellow and shows me that that value has changed. So it kind of helps you see, hey, what variables are changing in your code, which really helps debug when our programs get a little bit more complicated. Okay? And then we'll go to the, now watch sum. Sum we're adding number to, so sum is going to change up here. So I click step over. It goes to sum, and it puts that value into sum. It assigns that value to sum. Now it's going to do my Boolean check. And 5 doesn't equal 0, so it should skip this line of code and go to this line of code. And it does. Okay. It says the number you entered, and notice that when I run this line of code, I haven't actually run it until I hit step over. It goes ahead and puts that in the output. Now when it got to the end of that while loop, where did it go? You can see where it went. It jumped up here to the beginning of the while loop, and now it's going to check the Boolean statement again. I can click step over. Now it's waiting for me to enter in a number. Now watch, number changed, and now sum is going to change. When I click step over, it'll run that line of code and add number to sum. And we could see that it did do it correctly. It's going to do our Boolean check again. It's going to be false and skip that if statement. Remember, it skips that if statement and goes to my system out print line. And it prints it out and says the number you entered is 4. At the end of the while loop, it goes back up to the top, and it checks our Boolean statement another time. So this time around, I'm going to go ahead and enter in the number 0. It's going to add 0 to my sum, and now this is going to be true. And actually, I did my, this is a logic error, so I did that logic error on purpose, right? It ups my count by 1, do a system out print line, but now my Boolean statement's going to be false. I can see that number does have the 0 value. 0 does not equal 0 is false, so it'll get me out of my while loop. Do you see how it jumped to the end of my while loop? It does my count minus minus. You see how count changed? And actually I'm going to have a divide by 0 error here. Notice that I have sum times 1.0 divided by 0. I had a logic error in my program. And it changes average to infinity and then prints out infinity. Now when if you're in debug mode, to get out of debug mode, there's these 2 buttons up here at the top. They call it debug perspective, and then your Java perspective. I just click on Java perspective, and there I am, I'm back in my program. And so then I know where my error was in my program now. My count wasn't being incremented correctly, so now I can fix that in my program. Now to get rid of breakpoints, you just double click on the breakpoint again to get rid of them. And that's pretty much the debugger in a nutshell. Alright, so try out the debugger. It'll help you figure out how your loops are working, and plus it can help you fix your programs. Okay?